I'm going to look at the feasts of Yehovah. That's kind of the English approximation that we have. We'll look at a few of the words for the various things to which we are called. We'll look at what the requirements are of us on the feast days, and for those particular times. You'll see what I mean as I go through it. Towards the end of the first part, I'll look at Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, the feasts basically that we've already done this year. Perhaps that'll be useful for you next year. And then in the second part, I'm going to look at where in the feast cycle we are at the moment, where we are today. So, thus far this year, we've had Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. And there's a period of time which is kind of in the middle of these, which is where we are now, leading up to Pentecost. That is Shavuot. So the Hebrew word, Greek word being Pentecost, after the 50 days. Feast of the Trumpets in the seventh Chodesh, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. We'll have a look at all of those. Now, Romans 12 verse 2 is important for us to consider here. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you prove what is that good and well-pleasing and perfect desire of Elohim." So, I alluded to before the idea that leaving Christmas, leaving Easter, although personally for us subjectively, it might be a hard thing to do. Maybe our families don't understand that those things are not good to be done. But that is not being conformed to this world, leaving the celebrations and the festivities of this world behind is only the first part of this. It says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that is what is important for each one of us to do, because the word has things for us to do throughout the year. It's not just the appointed times, if you like, of the world. It's Yehovah's appointed times. They're the things which become important to us. And as we leave Christmas and Easter and things like that, then we move to something which is actually based on the truth of the word. And that's important. If you have a family and you've suddenly stopped doing Christmas, then it's important for you to show them what is right, not just saying this is wrong. A lot of people get caught up for varying lengths of time on the idea that those things are wrong. And they get caught up in looking into all sorts of things and saying this is pagan or that's pagan, and really missing the point of why those things are wrong. You know, I wear a wedding ring, and there are innumerable people who will say wearing a wedding ring is pagan. Well, I don't know the roots of wearing a wedding ring. Maybe it is pagan. But there are many things that are pagan that are not, or pagan traditions that were not evil in their inception. The reason that doing Christmas and Easter is wrong is because you are worshipping Yehovah by the means by which the pagans worship their gods. The wedding ring was about worshipping gods. I wouldn't wear one, obviously. But it's not. We do many things that the pagans also do. You know, motor vehicles are pagan. You're going to stop driving a car? Well, that's obviously nonsensical. And focusing on all these things that people have a problem with because they had a pagan origin is missing the point. You're obviously not going to stop driving your car or, eating certain dishes that were invented by pagans originally, or stopping using your mobile phone. None of those things are wicked, because none of them involve the worship of other gods. So we're not conformed to this world in regards to those things which are wicked, which are evil. But as I say, an important thing in that process is being transformed by renewing your mind to those things which are good. So don't get caught up on the idea these things are evil and just make that what your entire life becomes about, because I've seen that happen in people. When they turn to the Torah, they focus on those things. Instead, take on board what is good from that, not doing things that the pagans do to worship their gods, and be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because that is how you're going to be a light to the people who are around you. That is how you're going to show your family how to walk, rather than just saying, this is bad, we're not going to do this anymore. You say, this is what is good, we are going to do this. Okay, and in that vein, I would say, particularly Sukkot. Okay, Sukkot is essentially a week-long celebration with 2 high Sabbaths at either end of the week, the first day and then the 8th day at the end of the week, in which you dwell in tents. So that's a great thing to move on to, celebrating Sukkot. And all of the feasts, all of them contain important truths, as we'll see. But that's how you can teach your family about how to actually walk in Yahovah's ways and how to walk in what is good, rather than focusing on, no, that's evil, that's bad, we can't do that, that's what God's about. He's about stopping all of these things, which you may well hold dear, you might be saying to your family. So don't get caught up in the do not be conformed to this world end of the equation. Also, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and the feasts are a great opportunity to do such. Now, Daniel 7:25 says, it speaks words against the Most High, and it wears out the set-apart ones to the Most High, and it thinks or intends, the word used there can mean both, to change times and law, and they are given into its hand until a time, times, and half time, which is Adadan, Vidan, Vuplag, Idan. Okay, it's a phrase that people misunderstand, but maybe that's a topic for another time. Now, this is written in Aramaic, so the words here aren't going to be the Hebrew words which are used for appointed times, but this word as zimnin, which is used here, the Aramaic plural, means a time which is appointed. Okay, and have we seen something in the world which has changed appointed times and the law of God to other things? Okay, maybe we don't do the law of God anymore. We've abrogated the law of God, and now we are going to celebrate Christmas and Easter. I think that we have seen something like that. So we need to bear in mind that this is what was always prophesied to happen through the empires, the kingdoms that came to be on the earth. We now have the responsibility of not being conformed to the world with its changed laws and appointed times, and being transformed by the renewing of our minds. Verse 1 says, and Yahovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the appointed times of Yahovah which you are to proclaim as set apart gatherings, my appointed times are these. So going in here, we need to understand some of these Hebrew words. You'll see Moeday is different from Moedim, Okay, these just how Hebrew works. The word there is moed, which is being changed. The concept is moed, so we will look at the word moed. You also have set apart gatherings or holy convocations, you might read in some places. Mikrei Kodesh is what the Hebrew words are. Kodesh just meaning holy. So holy Mikrei. Mikrei is the plural of Mikra. So just like we'll look at Moed, we'll also look at Mikra, what that means. There is another word as well, which is important for us to look at. We see that later in the chapter, Leviticus 23. It says, on the first day is a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work. For 7 days you bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. On the 8th day there shall be a set-apart gathering for you. And you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. It is and it says here, a closing festival. You might read in some translations, a solemn assembly. But these are the three words or the three concepts in Hebrew that we will familiarize ourselves with, so that as you're reading through the instructions for the feasts, you can understand what is actually being asked of you on each of those occasions. If you want to read the scriptures about the feasts, you want to read this chapter, Leviticus 23. You also want to read Exodus 23. Also, Deuteronomy 16. Okay, they're the three chapters which will inform you about the feasts, and we'll be dipping in and out of them variously, but we'll go through the whole of Leviticus 23. So the first word that we're going to look at is moed. Okay, the word moed, it says here, appointed place, appointed time. It's to do with appointment. You'll see here the root word, that means the verb from which it comes is ya'ad. Okay, and what ya'ad is to do with is something which is appointed. If you were to ya'ad something, you would appoint it. So a moed, with the root word of ya'ad, is something which is appointed. And you'll actually see it used variously. The most familiar to you may well be the Moedim. People call them his appointed times. And that's a good translation of them. You could say his appointments, Moedim being the plural of Moed. So you could say they were his appointments. Since it is talking about times throughout the year, appointed times seems to me to be a reasonable translation. But just so you can understand, when it says Moedim, it's talking about things that Yehovah has appointed, specifically times that he's appointed for certain activities. The other word that we saw there is mikra, or mikrei, if we're using the plural, kodesh. Kodesh is the qualifier, it is holy. So mikra, which are kodesh, of course we read Hebrew from right, read it to left. So this is mikra, or mikrei is the word there, kodesh. Okay, so they are his holy mikrei. Okay, mikrei being the plural. So you could put holy convocations if you want, or set apart gatherings. People have different words to approximate what is meant by mikrei. If we look at the word mikra, the single, it says here, convocation, reading, a calling together. But really we get the best understanding if we look at its verb root. Calling together is actually pretty good. The verb root is kara. We look at kara. So the word kara is all concerned with calling, whether you're calling somebody by name. You see here, to summon or to invite, to call for. So a mikra is something that you are invited to. A calling has gone out to you, and you're called to observe this day. Okay, in the context of what this mikra is, it will be a day. So it's not just a day which has been appointed by Yehovah, but it's a day that you are called to. Okay, and not only are you called to it, it is a mikra kodesh. Kodesh meaning holiness. Okay, so it is a set apart day. You are called to this holy appointed day. Okay, so whether or not you attend to assemble with other believers, you should set that day apart from the other days. Okay, it's to be a holy day. But these days are days that you are called to. Okay, and I would say if you're being called to something by Yehovah, that it is incumbent upon you to answer that call. Okay, but there are days that are mikra, that you are called to, that you're not only called to, but you are mandated to answer the calling, if you like. Okay, and that brings us to the word atzarah. Atzarah, we see it in Leviticus 23, verse 36. It says, "For 7 days you bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. On the 8th day there shall be a set apart gathering." Okay, so a mikra kodesh for you, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. It is an atzarah. You do no servile work. So forget about the words closing festival or solemn assembly or anything like that. They don't really get across what the word atzarah really means. In order to understand what it means in the scriptures, we should look where else it is used in the scriptures. We see the same thing for the last day of unleavened bread. So this verse is talking about Sukkot, dwell in tents for 7 days. On the 8th day, there is a set-apart gathering, and it's an atzarah. So the last day of Sukkot and the last day of unleavened bread, which is what Deuteronomy 16:8 is referring to, we also have an atzarah. So it's important for us to understand what an atzarah is. See the word atzarah. Again, here we see the outline of biblical usage has it as assembly or solemn assembly. That doesn't really get across what it is. Even the definition which is used here doesn't really get across what that day actually is. We have to remember the limitations of certain resources like Strong's, because if the translators do not understand the concept, they cannot tell you what it really means. And atzarah is a word which is not very common in Scripture. Again, to understand atzarah, it's good to understand what the verb root means. So we see here that the verb root is atzar. Atzar speaks of restraining. Okay? It says here, primitive root to enclose, by analogy to hold back, also to maintain, rule, assemble, be able, close up, detain, fast, keep, prevail, recover, refrain, rein, restrain, retain, shut as in shutting up, slack, stay, stop, or withhold. So it has some aspect of its meaning which is to do with that. It's to do with restraining or holding back. Actually, what the word means, and we'll see this as we go through the verses, is that it is a day upon which you are restrained to do a certain thing. So you must do it. It's mandated that you do that thing. It's a mandatory assembly, would probably be a better translation of that concept. As I say, it's not a word that's used very commonly in the scriptures, but by looking at when it's used, we can see of what sort it actually is. So this is Gesenius's entry on this Hebrew word. You can see towards the end here, there is discussion of scholarly disagreements about what it means. One person saying that it means restraint from work, but there is an acknowledgement that this element of restraint is present. I would disagree with the idea that it was about restraint from work. Surely that would make all Sabbaths also atzarah, but that is not true. Okay, the restraint is a restraint to do something, not a restraint from doing something. If we look at the Gesenius's entry for the verb root, atzar, we see here it's the idea of holding back or to detain, again, to restrain by rule, or to rule, to restrain something by rule, in other words. To be restrained or hindered, it could be. To be gathered together from the idea of restraining or compelling. Okay, and this is how this word is used. Okay, it's kind of a compelled or a mandatory gathering of people, that they're restrained to have to do this thing, that everyone has to do it, young or old. That's how we're going to see this word used elsewhere in Scripture. Okay, so it's an idea of a restraint by the rule of Yehovah, his Torah, that it restrains you to do this action. So we see it in Leviticus 23, verse 8 in this Torah portion. So we see it used in Joel 1:14. Set apart a fast, call an atzarah, gather the elders, all the inhabitants of the land. And this is a peculiarity of the word atzarah, which is important. When an atzarah is called, everyone has to gather. Okay, so you see the idea of it being something which is mandatory coming through. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land. Similarly, where we see it used in Joel 2, it's used in a similar way. So these aren't the atzarah of Yehovah that are being spoken of here. This is men calling an atzarah. Call an atzarah, gather the elders, gather everyone together. Similarly, in Joel 2:15-16, blow a ram's horn in Sion, set apart a fast, call an atzarah, gather the people, set the assembly apart, assemble the elders, gather the children and nursing babes, let a bridegroom come out from his room and a bride from her dressing room. So no matter what people are occupied with, no matter who they are, gather the old, gather the young, gather the bridegroom if he's off doing his thing, the bride, everyone from what they are occupied with, gather them all together. That is how we see the word atzarah used. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land. 2 Kings 10 verse 20 says, and Jehu said, set apart an assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it, an atzarah. And Jehu sent for all Israel, and all the servants of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. And they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was filled from end to end. So when Yehovah proclaims an atzarah, it's the same. Okay, if an atzarah is called for Baal, and everyone comes, there wasn't left anyone who didn't come, then the same is true with Yehovah's atzarah. When we call an Atzarah, everyone has to come. The young have to come. The old have to come. Doesn't matter what you're occupied with. And the two examples that we've seen of that are the last day of unleavened bread and the 8th day of Sukkot. So an observation that Charlie made was that would mean that people would have to attend those gatherings. If the last day you have to be there, you may as well be there for the rest. Okay, these are not responsibilities that you can just shirk and say, oh, I'm not going to do that for whatever reason. Okay, these are things that have been appointed by Yehovah. They've been set apart by Yehovah, and they are mandatory. You are restrained to have to attend those things. So these are important days. Jeremiah 9 verse 2 says, "Oh, that I had in the wilderness a lodging place for wayfaring men, and I would leave my people and go from them, for they are all adulterers and atzarah of treacherous men." So this is Yehovah using hyperbole here. He's saying, my people are so bad, they are as an atzarah of treacherous men. If all the treacherous men had to be called together, that is how my people are. So it's interesting that this word was kind of commonly understood, even though for us now, as we're picking back up the Torah and trying to understand it, it's a concept that we have to discover. It was a word that was so well understood that Yehovah could allude to how bad his people were by calling them an atzarah of treacherous men. Leviticus 23, 35 to 36 says, "On the first day is a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work. For 7 days you bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. On the 8th day there shall be a set-apart gathering for you, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. It is an atzarah. You do no servile work." So this is the verse, of course, that we looked at before. From this verse, we can see that some Kodesh Mikra, or Mikre, are just Kodesh Mikre, and some are Atzarah. As I've mentioned, that's the last day of unleavened bread and the 8th day of Sukkot, also the last day of Sukkot. They are Atzarah. So now we can understand exactly what this verse is saying. It's not a closing festival. That's just the guess of these translators. Okay, if we look at how the word is used, it is a mandated gathering in this context, the Kodesh Mikra, which is mandated. Verse 3 says, 6 days work is done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a set-apart gathering. You do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yehovah in all your dwellings. So the Sabbath day itself is a Kodesh Mikra. Okay, something that you are invited to, that you are called to. Now, of course, there are elements of the Sabbath that are mandatory. You must do no work. Okay, we're told there, you do no work. It is a Sabbath. So there are elements of it which are mandatory. However, it is not an atzarah. It is not mandated that you gather on that day. But it's interesting to note that the Sabbath is an appointed time. Okay, Yehovah has appointed that day. And it is a Kodesh Mikra. It's set apart from the other periods of time that we experience. So that is how you should approach the Sabbath day. Okay, this is a day that you've been invited or called to, and that it is set apart from the rest of the days. And then what we're told of it is you do no work on that day because it's a Sabbath, which means rest. So what we're going to see as we go through the rest of Leviticus 23, and something which is important for you to have as knowledge, is that there are 3 harvests throughout the year. There's the barley harvest, there's the wheat harvest, and there is the fruit harvest at the end of the year. The Feast of First Fruits is when the first fruits of the barley harvest are presented, and the Feast of First Fruits is a part of the week of unleavened bread. Okay, Passover is the preparation day. Unleavened bread begins in the evening of the 14th and endures until the evening of the 21st of the first month. And that is all around the barley harvest. The wheat harvest is the second harvest that they would have during the year, and that is when Shavuot takes place. It's sometimes called the Festival of First Fruits. Okay, not to be confused with first fruits during unleavened bread. This is when the first fruits of the wheat harvest would be brought. The third harvest is the fruit harvest, and that is what must be completed before Sukkot can begin. That's what we're told in Scripture. So 3 times in a year, people would have to come up to Jerusalem, as we read in Exodus 23. 3 times in the year you are to observe a festival to me. Keep the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days you eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the Chodesh of Aviv. For in it you came out of Egypt, and do not appear before me empty-handed. And the festival of the harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field, and the festival of the ingathering, at the outgoing of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year, all your males are to appear before the Master Yahovah. So what they're asked to do actually is to go up to Jerusalem. That's how they would appear before Yahovah. We read in Deuteronomy 16:16-17, it says, 3 times a year, all your males are to appear before Yahovah your Elohim in the place which he chooses, at the festival of unleavened bread, at the festival of weeks, at the festival of tabernacles, and none should appear before Yahovah empty-handed, but each one with the gift of his hand, according to the blessing of Yahovah your Elohim, which he has given you. So what does that mean? We saw how the word mincha means gift or present. We see Jacob presenting mincha to Esau, for example. This word is just another word for gift. So you come before Yahovah with the gift of your hand to give to him. What would that gift have been? They were commanded to bring a tithe 3 times a year. What was the tithe that they would bring? It was a tithe of their harvest. When they harvested in the food, they had been increased, and we are told to bring a tithe of our increase. So they would bring 10%, which is what tithe means. The word ma'asah means tenth, i.e. 10% of. That's what they would bring up, which is why it's according to the blessing of Yahovah your Elohim, which he has given you. Why? Because each person would give of what they have been increased by. What Elohim had given to them, they would take 1/10 of that and give to Elohim. So according to what he has given to you, you give to him. According to the blessing of Yahovah, you give your gift to Yahovah. So people ask infrequently but occasionally about when a tithe is to be given. I was asked just recently this question. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at that. The Israelites gave a tithe every time they had a harvest, every time they were increased, they gave a tithe of that. So that would be a reasonable way to look at it. The other way to look at it is they gave a tithe 3 times a year. When the harvests actually were, they happened on the 3 times that they were called to Jerusalem. So another reasonable way of doing it would be to give the gift of your hand 3 times a year, having set it apart the rest of the year, because that's the important thing with the tithe. You set it apart, and it is set apart to Yehovah. Okay, so what you wouldn't do is wait 3 times a year and then work out what your tithe would have been and then give that. It's important that you set aside a tenth of what Yehovah increases you with. Whether or not you give it 3 times a year, or whether you give it each time you are increased. As I say, both are reasonable ways to do that. However, the important thing is that you are setting apart what is Yehovah's, and that you are not treating that which is set apart as profane. As we saw before, that's a big no-no. Another question which naturally comes up when we're considering the feast days is, when are these feast days? When Yehovah says, do this on the first day of the 7th month, does he mean the 1st of August? Maybe that would naturally seem correct to us living in the world. The calendar that we have in the world, Yehovah has a different calendar. So if you want to see when we keep the feast days, then if you go to our website at the top here, you'll see a tab which is called Resources. Go into the Resources tab and you'll be able to see the calendar, which spans across 2 of our years. So this calendar will be the 2022 to 2023 calendar, because the biblical years, or the biblical year, will end in 2023. So if you want to know the dates that we keep, that's where our calendar can be found. It's worth bearing in mind that our calendar is worked out based on a location of the UK. So if you want to learn more about the calendar, or about how to reckon Chodeshim from where you are in the world, this video will teach you about the calendar. This video will teach you about the reckoning of the first Chodeshim and any other Chodeshim, in fact, among other things. This video will teach you about how the year is divided in Scripture into 12 distinct periods called Chodeshim, and how the only one of the sun, the moon, and the stars which actually divides the year into 12 is the sun's transit through the 12 constellations that the pagans have appropriated as the zodiac, which are referred to in Scripture as the Mazzaroth. Actually, the pagan zodiac has 13 signs in now, but the Mazzaroth has only ever had 12, and that divides the year into 12. So if you've been using the new moon to reckon the beginning of months, then that is not what the Scriptures instruct. And if that's surprising to you, I would recommend this video. This video, I discuss the idea of intercalation. All the other calendars out there will have something along the lines of, after the 32nd Thursday in the 7th year, you add a day, and if you do that, the calendar works out. None of those instructions are given in Scripture. If we track the sun's movement through the 12 constellations, it divides every single year into 12 exactly, and has from the beginning of time, and always will. It will always do that. Sun's movement through the constellations. That's how we reckon Chodeshim. I also look at other issues that people bring up, verses that are misunderstood that talk about the moon, what those things are actually talking about. So if the calendar is of interest to you, or you want to know why we use the calendar that we do, I recommend those 2 videos to you. Let's start with the set apart Mikra for this year, though. Verse 4 says, "These are the appointed times of Yehovah, set apart gatherings which you are to proclaim at their appointed times. In the first Chodesh, on the 14th day of the Chodesh, between the evenings, is the Passover to Yehovah." Exodus 12 verse 6 says, "And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same Chodesh. Then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings." And what it means by between the evenings is you've got sundown, which is one of these scriptural evenings, and then you've got full darkness, which is both when the next day begins and the second evening. You kill it between the evenings, and it is eaten, as we will see, on the first day of unleavened bread. So you kill it between the evenings, then it is prepared and eaten, and you must eat it with unleavened bread. Why? Because it's the first day of unleavened bread, which we will see goes from the evening of the 14th to the evening of the 21st. Deuteronomy 16, 1-8 says, "Guard the Chodesh of Aviv, and do the Passover to Yehovah your Elohim. For in the Chodesh of Aviv, Yehovah your Elohim brought you out of Egypt by night. And you shall sacrifice the Passover to Yehovah your Elohim from the flock and the herd in the place where Yehovah chooses to put his name. Eat no leavened bread with it. For 7 days you eat unleavened bread with it, bread of affliction." So it's part of those 7 days. "Because you came out of the land of Mitzrayim in haste, so that you remember the day in which you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. And no leaven should be seen with you in all your border for 7 days, neither should any of the meat which you sacrifice in the evening on the first day stay all night until morning. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates which Yehovah your Elohim gives you. But the place where Yehovah your Elohim chooses to make his name dwell, there you sacrifice the Passover in the evening at the going down of the sun, at the appointed time you came out of Mitzrayim. And you shall roast and eat it in the place which Yehovah your Elohim chooses. And in the morning you shall turn and go to your tents. 6 days you eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there is a closing festival to Yehovah your Elohim. You do no work." Okay, so we learn a few things from that. One thing we learn is that the Passover is only to be sacrificed in Jerusalem. So anybody who is killing a lamb as a sacrifice on Passover is doing it wrong. We also learn, if we go back to this slide, okay, no leaven should be seen with you in all your border for 7 days. So part of the practicality of Passover unleavened bread is that you should be cleaning out from your house anything with leaven in. And people will commonly ask, I live with someone who doesn't observe this. What am I to do? Well, my answer would be clear leaven out from where you live. Okay, you can't force anyone else to follow the word of Elohim. You're not responsible for what they do. But out of the bit where you live, the bit that you control, your bedroom or whatever it might be, clear anything with leaven out. Okay, and leaven isn't just yeast. Okay, leaven is something which causes something to rise. So if you read the back of the packet and it says that it contains raising agents, then that is leaven. Leaven originally would have been a part of the previous loaf. I mean, that would be put in the next loaf and that would cause it to rise. So that's what leaven is. It's anything that causes something to rise. And we can see that from when we see leaven mentioned in the scriptures. It's something which has an effect on the things that surround it. That's how it's used idiomatically. Okay, so they were to do this and they were to eat it as the day became the first day of unleavened bread. So it was killed between the evenings, it was roasted with fire. By the time they were eating it, it was the first day of unleavened bread. We're not to sacrifice it anywhere where we live, so you shouldn't be sacrificing animals anyway. But what people like to do is try to follow the instructions given in Exodus 12. But what we have to remember is the instructions in Exodus 12 were not the instructions that we are to follow. Okay, they were given those instructions as what they were to do as they were leaving Egypt. For us, we are told the Passover will become a remembrance. And that's why we see different instructions given in Deuteronomy 12, in Leviticus 23. They're different from Exodus 12 because that's what they were to do. We are just to remember it. This is what we are to do. Okay? For us, we can't go to Jerusalem. We don't have a temple. We can't sacrifice the lamb. So we don't sacrifice a lamb. For us, what we do in order to remember it, and what I mean by that, for us personally, what we do is we hold a dinner during which we remember when the children of Israel were freed from Egypt, and we also remember our Passover lamb, Yeshua Messiah. That brings us to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Of course, these things have now passed during this year, but these are things that very commonly people want instruction in, so it's profitable to go over them. For unleavened bread, as I say, you're to clear any leaven out of your house or out of your living space. And we are told, not only don't eat any leavened bread or any leaven for 7 days, also we are told to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So you should have leavened bread prepared to eat. Have it prepared to eat on the first day and the seventh day so that you're not preparing bread on the Sabbath days. And you can prepare it the other days if you want it fresh on the other days. Okay, but you should eat unleavened bread for the 7 days of the observance. So verse 6 says, and on the 15th day of this Chodesh is the festival of unleavened bread to Yehovah. 7 days you eat unleavened bread. On the first day you have a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah for 7 days. On the seventh day is a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work. So, as I mentioned, of course, we're not bringing animal sacrifices. I wish that we could. I wish that Yehovah was living in a house in our midst. However, he's not. We don't have a place where we can lawfully bring sacrifices. They would be what we might describe in English as strange sacrifices, in the same way that the fire brought by Nadab and Abihu was strange. It was unlawful for them to bring it. So if we were to bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah, It would be a strange offering. It's not something that we can do. Exodus 12:33-34 is where this comes from. It says, "And the Mitzrites urged the people to hasten to send them away out of the land, for they said, 'We are all dying.' And the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their garments on their shoulders." Okay, and that is why we today do not eat leavened bread for this period. They took the bread before it was leavened because they left in haste, and we are to remember when they left the land of Egypt. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you cause leaven to cease from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And on the first day is a set-apart gathering, and on the 7th day you have a set-apart gathering. No work at all is done on them. Only that which is eaten by every soul, that alone is prepared by you. Now, it's important to remember at this point, this is a part of Exodus 12. These are not instructions for us today. These were instructions for them as they were leaving the land of Egypt. We are given the instructions that we follow in the Torah. As we saw, Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16 is where you go for those instructions. So it's not true that we can cook on the 1st and 7th day. This again was a provision which was made by Yehovah to say, okay, usually this is how things would be done. Okay, usually you wouldn't be cooking on these days. However, you can prepare what must be eaten by every soul. Okay, they could prepare the unleavened bread. And you shall cherish the festival of unleavened bread. For on this same day I brought your divisions or your armies, your Sabbath, out of the land of Mitzrayim, and you shall cherish this day throughout your generations, an everlasting law. And indeed, we now do keep this day in the same way as they did. In the first Chodesh, on the 14th day of the Chodesh, in the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the Chodesh in the evening. So, the order that we have, between the evenings on the 14th day, Passover lamb is killed. Okay, then it would be roasted with fire. From the evening of the 14th, we've then got 7 days. Those 7 days are evening of the 14th to the 15th, evening of the 15th to the 16th, 2 days, 16th to the 17th, 17th to the 18th, 18th to the 19th, 19th to the 20th, 20th to the 21st. That's 7 days. And when do those days occur? They occur from the evening of the previous day until the following evening, when the next day begins. Okay, so the evening of the 21st day is when the 22nd day would occur. But that's your 7 days, evening until evening. Every time the scriptures tell us when the days run from, it tells us evening until evening. Don't let people confuse you with verses that they have misunderstood, that may be mistranslated, or there's a whole array of different problems which lead people to misunderstand the days as running from the morning onwards. We're quite familiar with that, the idea that we go to bed, when we wake up it's a new day. That's easy, a simple thing for us to understand, but the way that Scripture describes when days run, it's always evening until evening. For 7 days, no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that same soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Do not eat that which is leavened. In all your dwellings you are to eat unleavened bread. In Exodus 13, continuing from Exodus 12, It says, 7 days you eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day is a festival to Yehovah. Unleavened bread is to be eaten the 7 days. Whatever is leavened is not to be seen with you. Leaven is not to be seen with you in all your border. So, simple takeaway: clear your house of leaven during that time period. Do not eat anything which is leavened during that time period, and eat unleavened bread on each of the 7 days. Now that covers leaven from, if you like, the physical world point of view. What is leaven literally? It is the starter that they would add to the dough from the previous loaf so that it would rise. But leaven is used figuratively in the scriptures as well. Leaven is used figuratively as something which has an influence, sometimes a negative influence, sometimes a positive influence on the things which are around it. We see leaven referred to in Luke 12, verse 1. Meanwhile, when an innumerable crowd had gathered together so that they trampled one another, he began to say to his disciples, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." And they confuse what he's talking about, because leaven would be something that was familiar to do with bread, and they thought that he was angry at them for not bringing bread. But he says the leaven of the Pharisees is hypocrisy. And Mark 8:15, Yeshua was warning them, saying, "Mind, beware of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herodes." So in this instance, this is used of a negative influence. We see in 1 Corinthians that Paul is speaking to them of having somebody who is a bad influence in their midst. And he speaks to them and he says that a little leaven leavens the entire lump. If you permit somebody who is doing things wrong in the midst of your congregation, then that little bit of leaven will leaven the entire lump. So we can learn from that. If there are people who are hard-headed and stubbornly refuse to walk in the Torah, that we should not have them in our midst, because we're taught by Scripture that having them in our midst will have a leavening effect on the rest of the people. It is commonly reported that there is whoring among you, and such whoring is not even named among the Gentiles. Even the Gentiles will not do this, so as one to have his father's wife. And you have been puffed up, and did not rather mourn, so that he who has done this deed be removed from you. For I indeed, as absent in body but present in spirit, have already judged the one who did this, as though I were present. In the name of our Master Yeshua Messiah, when you are gathered together in my spirit with the power of our Master Yeshua Messiah, deliver such a one to Hasatan for destruction of the flesh, in order that his spirit be saved in the day of the Master Yeshua. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the entire lump? Therefore cleanse out the old leaven, so that you are a new lump, as you are unleavened. For also Messiah, our Passover, was offered for us. So then let us observe the festival, not with old leaven, not with the leaven of evil and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So the leaven that they had in their midst was no good. Okay, so Paul says, let us observe this festival, unleavened bread. They were keeping the festival of unleavened bread. But he is alluding here to let us also remove the leaven of wickedness and evil, and let us be unleavened bread, i.e. let us act without the negative leaven with sincerity and truth. As he puts it in the book of Galatians, you were running well. Who held you back from obeying the truth? That persuasion does not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens all the lump. Okay, so again, he repeats this here. Don't allow these things in your midst, whether it's in the midst of the body or whether it's in the midst of us individually, because they will have a negative, corrupting effect. Matthew 13, verse 33 says, another parable Yeshua spoke to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, until it was all leavened. So Yeshua here speaks of the kingdom of heaven as a good type of leaven, where the kingdom of heaven is added and it leavens all of it. Okay, Yeshua uses the parable of that anyway. He says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It will, from a small inception, it will grow into something big. That brings us to the Feast of First Fruits. Okay, the Feast of First Fruits actually happens during unleavened bread. As we'll see, it happens the morrow after the Sabbath. Verse 9 says, and Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, and shall reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yehovah for your acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest waves it. Okay, so the morrow after the Sabbath. I'm not going to get into all the linguistics of it, but this is very different, very definitely the weekly Sabbath, which is spoken of here. And it has to be for multiple different reasons, not least of which would be you count 7 Sabbaths after first fruits, and the day after the 7th Sabbath is the 50th day. That can only be true if the morrow after the Sabbath is the weekly Sabbath. But regardless, during the week of unleavened bread, there will be a Sabbath, because it's a period of 7 days. Every period of 7 days has to have at least one Sabbath. So on the morrow after that day, that is when the Feast of First Fruits was. And as you can see, the sheaf was harvested and it was brought to the priest, and the priest waved it before Yehovah. And on the 3rd day, when you wave the sheaf, you shall prepare a male lamb. And on that day, when you wave the sheaf, you shall prepare a male lamb, a year old, a perfect one, as a burnt offering to Yehovah. And its grain offering, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to Yehovah, a sweet fragrance, and its drink offering, 1/4 of a hin of wine. The grain offerings would be accompanied with a drink offering. And you do not eat bread or roasted grain or fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Elohim, a law forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. So they were not allowed to eat of that harvest until they had brought the first of it to Yehovah. In John 20, verse 1, we see this is the day that Yeshua was raised, okay, on the first day of the week. So you have the 7th day, the Sabbath, and then the first day is the morrow after the Sabbath. And that is when we see Yeshua being raised. It happened on the same day. That's for a very particular reason. 1 Corinthians 15:20-23 says, but now Messiah has been raised from the dead and has become the first fruits of those having fallen asleep. For since death is through a man, resurrection of the dead is also through a man. For as all die in Adam, so also all shall be made alive in Messiah. And each in his own order, Messiah the firstfruits, then those who are of Messiah at his coming. So that's why he was raised on that day, because he was the firstfruits of the resurrection. So that brings us to an end of those feasts which surround the barley harvest. And it's actually at that point in time that we are today. But I'm going to look at where we are currently in the feast cycles from there onwards to the end of the year. But what we've covered so far, we've had the 14th day of the month, or the Chodesh of Aviv, which this year fell from the 25th to the 26th. So it was actually on a Shabbat, the preparation day. And then the eating of the Passover remembrance meal started on the first day of unleavened bread. And then we got 7 days of unleavened bread. You have to bear with me doing the best that I can here. The calendar doesn't show Saturday to Sunday, and if it did, going from Sunday to Monday would be a problem. So I've gone from the end of Saturday here and then into Sunday here. So there's 2 circles to represent Saturday to Sunday. The first and the last day of unleavened bread. So our first day and that's the first day. And our last day here, which is just past, it's the 7th day of unleavened bread. And then after the weekly Sabbath in unleavened bread, we have the Feast of First Fruits, which bizarrely, or it seems bizarrely, falls out of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Usually you would have first fruits being a part of the week of unleavened bread, but that's not how it has to be. That's not what the instructions say. They just say after the weekly Sabbath. And since this year the weekly Sabbath was Passover, okay, that's not the Sabbath it's talking about. It's the weekly Sabbath in the order the instructions are given after the beginning of unleavened bread. So this year, strangely, it seems, it would be the day after the 7th day of unleavened bread. And that's where we'll pick up the instructions to go forward. Verse 15 says, "And from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you shall count for yourselves 7 completed Sabbaths." And this is, as I said before, this is what shows us that first fruits is on the first day of the week, because we have to count these 7 completed Sabbaths, and they are also described as 50 days from the morrow after the last of them. So 50 days can only start on the Feast of First Fruits being the first day of the week, which for us would be Saturday evening to Sunday evening. Deuteronomy 16 verse 9, "Count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain." So again, if those 7 weeks are going to run into Shavuot 50 days later, and they start from the Feast of First Fruits, which is when you begin to put the sickle to the grain, then the Feast of First Fruits has to be the first day of the week. Which brings us to Shavuot. "Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath." So again, we know that this morrow after the Sabbath is the weekly Sabbath, because you're counting 7 weekly Sabbaths. You count 50 days. Then you shall bring a new grain offering to Yehovah. So there are people who will come up with all sorts of weird ideas about when to make the Feast of First Fruits, but this is the only way which actually works. It says, bring from your dwellings for a wave offering 2 loaves of bread of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour, they are, baked with leaven, first fruits to Yehovah. So we are specifically told here that these loaves, the 2 of them which are to be waved, are to be baked with leaven. It says, besides the bread, you shall bring 7 lambs a year old, perfect ones, and 1 young bull, and 2 rams, and they are a burnt offering to Yehovah, with their grain offering and their drink offerings, an offering made by fire for a sweet fragrance to Yehovah. And you shall offer 1 male goat as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs a year old as a peace offering. And the priest shall wave them besides the bread, instead of beside the bread, of the first fruits, as a wave offering before Yehovah. Besides the 2 lambs, they are set apart to Yehovah for the priest. So the instructions that we actually have for Shavuot are very few, apart from the day that it is to be on. So are we to say, well, we can't do those instructions, so we don't do it at all? No, we see how we can fulfill that instruction. We know that the day for a start is a Sabbath. It's set apart. So we gather on that day. We as a fellowship remember that day by waving 2 loaves of bread that are baked with leaven. Now, we're not priests in the earthly tabernacle, but we remember it by remembering what the priests did. Obviously, we don't make any animal sacrifices because there is no temple and we're not priests. We're not able to do that, but we can wave 2 loaves of bread. You may have seen a picture of Charlie with the 2 loaves of bread, waving them previously, but just get 2 loaves of bread and wave them. That's a pretty simple thing that everyone can do. But the very least, and I'm not saying that that is something that you have to do to fulfill the Torah, the very least that the Torah requires is that it is a day of rest and it is a set-apart day. It's a set-apart calling when we are invited or called. So we gather together. That's how we keep it. For more on the application of what the church calls Pentecost, which is Shavuot in Hebrew, Pentecost referring to the 50 days. You might know Pentecost is when they received the Spirit from on high. If you would like more information about what that actually shows to us, and I'll give you a hint, it's to do with the 2 houses of Israel coming and being presented before Yehovah and receiving the Spirit. The reunification of the kingdom is what Pentecost was all about. But if you want more detail on that, this is the video for you. Verse 21 says, and on the same day you shall proclaim a set-apart gathering for yourselves. You do no servile work in it, a law forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. So we've had the barley harvest. We saw the first fruits of the barley harvest are offered on the Feast of First Fruits. The first fruits of the wheat harvest, we've just seen in these instructions, are to be offered on the 50th day on Shavuot, which, just like the Feast of First Fruits, is on a morrow after the Sabbath. So it will always be on the first day of the week. It's the morrow after the 7th Sabbath from first fruits, in fact. So that is the wheat harvest. So these harvests also may have prophetic meaning, but that's not something that I'm going to cover in this particular teaching. I've covered it before, which is in a teaching on the channel, but for now I want to focus on what we need to do practically, because I don't want people to be overwhelmed if they are new to keeping the Torah, thinking, what's all of this stuff about prophecy, which may or may not actually be the fulfillment of these feasts. I don't want people to be overwhelmed with that. I want you to concentrate just on what is required of you by the Torah, so that you set these days apart, because they have been set apart by Yehovah, and we honor that by setting them apart ourselves. We do no work on them, for example, apart from on the Feast of First Fruits. Okay, that is not a Sabbath of rest, but the rest of them are Sabbaths of rest. Of course, on the Feast of First Fruits, it's a good time to remember Yeshua being the first fruits of the resurrection. But it's another day that we don't have a whole load of instructions as to what we are to do. We can't go and take the first fruit of our harvest and get the priest to wave them before Yehovah. We can't give animal sacrifices, so it becomes another day upon which we remember. In verse 22 it says, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, do not completely reap the corners of your field when you reap, and do not gather any gleaning from your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am Yehovah your Elohim." So this is something which is true for all the harvests. When they were to harvest, they were to leave the gleanings, and they were for the poor and for the stranger. Okay, whichever harvest it was, this was part of how Yehovah provides for the poor and the stranger. Of course, he gives us instructions as to how to do the same, but this is a way in which he does it, by commanding in his Torah that all of the field is not reaped, that some of it is left for these people. Which brings us to the first day of the 7th Chodesh. Okay, so we started in the first Chodesh, 14th day Passover, 15th to the 21st, sundown on the 21st, is unleavened bread. The day after whichever Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath rather, whichever day it is in unleavened bread, usually this year it was the last day of unleavened bread. That day is then the Feast of First Fruits, after which we count 7 Sabbaths, and then on the day after the 7th Sabbath is Shavuot. Okay, so as long as you know the starting point, you can get to Shavuot. The 7th Chodesh is, a number of months or Chodeshim after that. So the first day is the Feast of Trumpets, another day that we're not given very many instructions over, beyond the fact that we are to spend the day blowing trumpets. So verse 23 says, "And Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th Chodesh, on the first day of the Chodesh, you have a rest, a remembrance of blown trumpets, a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah." So the instructions on that day are pretty straightforward. Blow trumpets. What we as a fellowship do is we meet up, we go somewhere, and we blow trumpets. We blow the trumpets as a remembrance. Trumpets are an alarm call, and that's what we spend the day doing, going and sounding the alarm, and you can do the same. People will often think of the horn pictured in this picture here So this horn, which is a kudu horn, people will often call this a shofar. This, however, is not a shofar. A shofar is a ram's horn. But you could purchase either of those online. A ram's horn, an actual real shofar, or what people refer to as a shofar, the kudu horn. And you can spend the day blowing the alarm. Either way, it's a set-apart day, set apart by Yahovah and observed by you. It is the Sabbath of rest, and we are commanded to blow trumpets on that day. The next day in the calendar is Yom Kippur, or Yom HaKippurim, as the Hebrew actually says, because Kippur is never a word that is used in the singular. It's always used in the plural. But regardless, we would know it in English as the Day of Atonement. Okay, if you go back to Torah portion Achrei Mot a couple of weeks ago, you will learn all about the Day of Atonement. But this is what we're commanded in Leviticus 23. It says, and Yahovah spoke to Moshe, saying, on the 10th day of the 7th Chodesh, and again, if you want to know when the Chodeshim start, I would refer you to those videos, is the Day of Atonement. It shall be a set-apart gathering for you, and you shall afflict your souls, and shall bring an offering made by fire to Yahovah. And you do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement to make atonement for you before Yahovah your Elohim. So what we are to do on that day, the instructions that we are given, that we can follow as non-priests in the earthly tabernacle, we are told to afflict our souls. These were the instructions that were given to the children of Israel. Leviticus 16:13, speaking of the high priest, said that on that day he shall put the incense on the fire before Yahovah, and the cloud of incense shall cover the lid of atonement which is on the witness, lest he die. So they were the instructions that were given for the high priest. When the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies on one day out of the year, the Holy of Holies was where Yahovah's presence dwelt in the tabernacle, and the high priest could only enter in once a year. Leviticus 23 continues and says, for any soul who is not afflicted on that same day, he shall be cut off from his people. So you need to know how to afflict your souls. Any soul who does any work on that same day, that soul I shall destroy from the midst of his people. You do no work, a law forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It is a Sabbath of rest to you, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the Chodesh at evening. From evening to evening you observe your Sabbath. So that's when the 10th day is. It's from the evening of the 9th day till the evening of the 10th day, just like unleavened bread. Scripture actually couldn't be any more clear on when a day starts and when it ends. But people get funny ideas in their heads about doctrine, and they pursue after these ideas, often on the basis of having misunderstood verses. But if you want to go by what the Bible says, it's evening until evening. And every day that's described as evening until evening. In Psalm 35 verse 13, it says, but I, when they were sick, I put on sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fastings. So this is a way that you can afflict your soul. I wept in my soul with fasting. In Isaiah 3-5, it says, they say, why have we fasted and you have not seen? Why have we afflicted our souls and you took no note? Look, in the day of your fasting, you find pleasure. So here we have the Day of Atonement, the day on which we afflict our souls, described by Yehovah as the day of your fasting. So he recognizes it as a day of fasting. But there's an important distinction to be drawn here. We do not have an instruction that says you must fast on Yom Kippur. We have an instruction that says you must afflict your soul on Yom Kippur. We see that that is done with fasting in the scriptures, but it's not that it has to be done with fasting. You can afflict your soul any way that your soul is afflicted. And beyond just fasting, you shouldn't be doing other things that you find pleasurable on the Day of Atonement. It's Yehovah's complaint here. On the day of your fasting, you find pleasure. So you're fasting, but you're not afflicting your souls as you've been commanded. People often confuse Isaiah 58 to be about the weekly Sabbath, but we can see that it is talking about Yom Kippur, okay? The day you afflict your souls. Look, you fast for strife and contention and to strike with the fist of wrongness. You do not fast as you do this day to make your voice heard on high. So you're not doing it right, is what he's saying. Is it a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? So Yehovah actually says here, is it a fast that I've chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Which to me suggests that he's not saying you have to fast. What he's saying is you have to afflict your soul. And I think of Yom Kippur as the commandment of commandments, if you like. It is the ultimate submission of one's will to Yehovah. If he simply says, do what you find displeasurable, afflict your soul. Okay, the other commandments are not so, but they do require us to be submitted to Yehovah. And on this day, he says, afflict your soul. So you could wear uncomfortable clothing, you could not take a shower, not brush your teeth, you could fast of food, you could fast of water, whatever it is that you find displeasurable, but I would say, do not find any pleasure on that day. That is the antithesis of what is being asked of you. Isaiah 58 verse 13 is the verse that people misunderstand so commonly. It says, if you do turn back your foot from the Sabbath, what Sabbath? Well, we've just read the rest of Isaiah 58. It's the day you afflict your soul on. It's Yom Kippur. From doing your pleasure on my set-apart day, continuing what has been spoken of, and shall call the Sabbath a delight. Well, what Sabbath? Yom Kippur, the set-apart day of Yehovah esteemed, and shall esteem it, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, again, speaking in the same terms that Isaiah 58 has, nor speaking your own words, not going your own way on the Sabbath day, not seeking after those things that you find pleasurable, but you take that one day a year to say, I'm going to afflict my soul, I'm going to be obedient to Yehovah. If you want to get instruction on how Yehovah wants us to observe Yom Kippur, I will point you to this video. This goes into a lot more detail than I've gone into in this summary of the feasts. So we've seen the barley harvest, the wheat harvest from Passover through Shavuot. We've had trumpets, we've had Yom Kippur, now we have the grape harvest. And after the grape harvest, we come to the final feast of the year, the feast of Sukkot. In verse 33 it says, and Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of this 7th Chodesh, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Sukkot, the Hebrew word Sukkot, the plural of the word Sukkah, for 7 days to Yehovah. On the first day is a Mikra Kodesh. You do no servile work. For 7 days you bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. On the 8th day there shall be a set-apart gathering for you, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah. It is an atzarah. You do no servile work. So for 7 days we keep the Feast of Sukkot, which involves dwelling in Sukkot, which are temporary dwellings. The thing most accessible to us is a tent. In order to remember when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and they dwelt in tents, or they dwelt in Sukkot for 7 days. So this is why we keep this feast. It's a very important feast. Deuteronomy 16:13-15 gives us more information, more instruction on the Feast of Sukkot. Perform the festival of Sukkot, or tabernacle, or booths, or however you want to translate it, for 7 days after the ingathering from your threshing floor and from your winepress. So we're told here specifically this is after the ingathering from your threshing floor and from your winepress. So this feast happens after the fruit harvest. And you shall rejoice in your festival, you and your son and your daughter, and your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite and the stranger, and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. For 7 days you observe a festival to Yehovah your Elohim in the place which Yehovah chooses, because Yehovah your Elohim does bless you in all your increase, and in all the work of your hands there shall be only rejoicing. So the Feast of Sukkot happens during the 7th Chodesh of a 12 Chodeshim year, and it's an important feast. They would have their harvest, then after their harvest they would come up with a tithe to Jerusalem, and everyone would be involved in celebrating for 7 days, ended with the 8th day, which was the Sabbath, and it was an atzarah when everyone had to gather. So at this point I will run you through all of the feasts as they appear on the calendar for this year. So we have Passover, followed by the 7 days of unleavened bread. The 1st and 7th day are Sabbaths. The 7th day is an atzarah. Then we have the Feast of First Fruits. Okay, or rather we had the Feast of First Fruits. Then following the Feast of First Fruits, you count 7 Sabbaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then the day after the 7th Sabbath is Shavuot. Then we move to the 7th Chodesh. The first day of the 7th Chodesh is also on the first day of the Hebrew week this year, Saturday evening to Sunday evening. That's the Feast of Trumpets. Then we have Yom Kippur on the 27th of September, and then to round out the year, the feast that we just learned about, the Feast of Sukkot. And the 1st and the 8th day, which as you can see are both on the first day of the Hebrew week this year, from Saturday evening to Sunday evening, they are high Sabbaths. Okay, it's actually the first day of the 7 days of dwelling in tents, and then the 8th day after the 7th night, that is a Sabbath. But for simplicity's sake, I've put it all here on the calendar so that you can see. If you want to be able to reckon the Chodeshim yourself, I would recommend watching the videos that I put up before, or if you have any interest in the calendar, particularly if you've been observing the new moon as the beginning of the month, I would recommend watching that video. Deuteronomy 23 continues and says, Leviticus 23 rather continues and says, these are the appointed times of Yehovah, which you proclaim as set-apart gatherings to bring an offering made by fire to Yehovah, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, as commanded for every day. Besides the Sabbaths of Yehovah, and besides your gifts, besides all your vows, besides all your voluntary offerings, which you give to Yehovah. On the 15th day of the 7th Chodesh, when you gather in the fruit of the land, observe the festival of Yehovah for 7 days. On the first day is a rest, and on the 8th day a rest. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day of the fruit of good trees, branches of palm trees, twigs of leafy trees, and willows of the stream, and shall rejoice before Yehovah your Elohim for 7 days. And you shall observe it as a festival to Yehovah for 7 days in the year, a law forever in your generations. Observe it in the 7th Chodesh. And I've got an example of what that might look like to make a sukkah out of the vegetation that you find around you. This is what Ashley did while I was here in the UK doing Sukkot, and she was in Texas waiting with our cat Perb to be able to come back. She built a sukkah on the balcony and she dwelt in a tent. Dwell in tabernacles, tents, booths, Sukkot for 7 days. All who are native Israelites dwell in tabernacles, so that your generations know that I made the children of Israel dwell in tabernacles when I brought them out of the land. I am Yehovah, your Elohim. And if you think, I'm not a native-born Israelite, so I don't have to do this, sounds like a whole lot of fuss, dwelling in a tent for 7 days. I point you to this teaching about who actually is a native-born Israelite. You might be surprised. And Leviticus 23 rounds out by saying, thus did Moshe speak of the appointed times of Yehovah to the children of Israel. So what we've learned is that there are days that Yehovah has appointed, that he is set apart, that we therefore observe as being set apart from the other days. A whole load of them we're not to do any work on. You've seen the days of this year that they are going to fall on. You know what you need to do now on those days. So now you are equipped to honor Yehovah. And Leviticus 23 kind of rounds out the instructions about being set apart. As his set apart people, we're going to act in ways that are peculiar to the world. And a big part of that is observing these days.